Oh, great. Cool. Boxes. Okay. So I'm glad people have an opportunity to let it all out. Have your family been supportive and stuff? Have you been able to speak to?
Yeah.
I think so. Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're here for the Dawn Foster Memorial Essay Prize launch, and I'm delighted to invite to the stage Kirsty, who's going to tell us a bit about the prize.
Thank you very much, Vince. I'm Kirsty Collins-Spinner, and I'm the project manager for the Housing, Construction and Infrastructure Skills Gateway, one of the supporters here of the After Pandemic at COP26. Events happening for the last 1.5 weeks, but a few more days to go at COP26 in Glasgow. The Housing, Construction and Infrastructure Skills Gateway, or HCI, as you see up there, is a £6 million investment by the UK and Scottish governments to build inclusive and diverse construction careers, to really rethink how we build houses, why we build them, and how we do that in a way that helps us achieve both a net zero and a sustainable future. And as part of that, we believe that the paradigm of how we encourage people into careers in construction engineering is fundamentally broken, and we need to rethink, reimagine, and redesign how we do that. As part of that, and many of you will know, Dawn Foster was a very esteemed housing journalist who reported on stories of people who, by the nature of their housing or their housing situation, were voiceless. Dawn Foster was also a really, really dear friend of mine since we were 20, and hung out quite a lot in Glasgow drinking in the old Strathclyde Union. And so it's a particular personal pleasure that we're able to both honour her impact as a housing journalist and to encourage new voices through that discussion and debate. And so to tell you about a little bit about the Essay Prize, it's being run in partnership with the magazine Red Pepper, and it opens today, and you can find it at hciskills.org/Dawn Foster. We'll of course tweet and broadcast that out afterwards. And it's a £2,000 prize open to any writer aged 35 or under on 31st January 2022, based in the UK. And it's on the theme of Britain's housing crisis. However you want to take that, whatever you want to write about. 1,500 words, please submit it. First prize is £1,500 and your essay being published in Red Pepper's Spring 2022 magazine. There are also 4 runner-up prizes of £200 as well. We do hope that we can have some brilliant entries, reimagining, redesigning, rethinking how we approach Britain's housing crisis. I'm really delighted that we're joined with this really fantastic panel today of Dawn's friends and colleagues to share a bit about why sustainable housing needs radical journalism.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. Thank you so much for your support in the run-up to this event. So hello from the Mandela Room at Strath Union in Glasgow for COP26 after the pandemic. This is the launch of the Dawn Foster Memorial Essay Prize and panel discussion around the theme, Why Sustainable Housing Needs Radical Journalism. I'm Kay Biswas. I'm a critic and a close friend of Dawn's, who passed away over the summer, aged just 34. Dawn will be remembered as Britain's leading journalistic chronicler of the age of austerity. In addition to columns for the Guardian newspaper and her frequent appearances as a broadcast commentator, Dawn was an exceptional social affairs journalist. With an intricate grasp of government policy and its implications on those living at the sharp end. She spent hundreds of hours meeting with low-paid workers, mums on maternity leave, those on 0 hours contracts, housing activists, people fighting for better pay and conditions. Her working class background and a dogged determination to get to the truth made Dawn rare in UK mainstream media. Someone compelled by personal experience to speak up for their class, ask difficult and uncomfortable questions, even when it threatened their own career and livelihood. We have an incredible panel here today of Dawn's friends and peers. We have to my left, Lindsay Hanley, who is the author of books Estates, An Intimate History, and Respectable, and presenter of the recent BBC Radio 4 housing series, A Home of Our Own. To my right, we have Dominic Hind, who is a lecturer in journalism and the media at the University of Glasgow and has an upcoming book coming out next year, Journalism in the Anthropocene, on Palgrave Macmillan. And on my far right, we have freelance journalist and researcher Sarah Woolley, who has written for The Guardian, The Independent, and ID magazine, while working on anti-poverty campaigns. If you have any questions for the panelists, you'll have a chance to ask them following the panel. And if you're watching via live stream, please send us a message on Twitter with the hashtag DawnFosterForever. So before we begin the discussion, I'd really like each panelist to say a few words about what Dawn's journalism and her friendship meant to them. Lindsay?
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming today. I feel very privileged and not a little nervous that coming here, being invited here by Kirsty and Liz to come and talk about drugs. It's just such an incredibly important thing that's happened in terms of allowing allowing a kind of a fund or a sort of an essay to be published in her name. It's inevitably quite tricky, sort of trying to explain really, but I can't really put it into words what Dawn's friendship and her writing meant to me, but I will try. We met in 2015, which obviously is relatively recently, but I've been reading her work for several years before then. She started writing pieces in The Guardian from, I think, about 2011 or 2012, was it, on the Comments is Free website, which I also wrote for, about things like that shocked me that they were getting, that they were actually getting an audience on Comments is Free about housing, about growing up in council housing, about growing up with experience of the care system, about growing up not being able to afford to eat in the summer. And she had this incredibly direct style that was also funny, completely unself-pitying, and was just completely fresh. And I read all her stuff without knowing who she was. I saw a little picture on the side of the cover, and that was all I knew about her. But eventually, I think she wrote a really excellent article summarising the impact of the right to buy council housing on British housing, British society, and what it had meant for people like her who'd grown up in council housing to find that access to council housing was becoming more and more reduced for people in difficult circumstances, or people in any circumstances for that matter. And so I can't remember how I found her email address. I didn't know how to write to her, but I found it somehow, and I found her email address, and I wrote to her straight away, and she got straight back to me. And it turned out that we were both doing this event in Bristol. So we arranged to meet, and I came with my whole family in tow because my daughter was very little and I was still breastfeeding and all that kind of thing. And she came with me, and we met, and we were trying to talk about housing and council housing and class and all this kind of stuff. And my daughter was just like flinging bits of food at her all the time. But the fact that she was completely unfazed by that meant that I just knew she was a good one. And I think immediately, we recognised in each other anger rather than indignation. And I think we both went into writing with an absolute compulsion to kind of express anger rather than the sort of hand-wringing indignation about society and about social issues. And I think the fact that we both believed that housing was central to everything meant that we always had so much to talk about, and we were always so angry about it. So, we really, really believed together, and I believe that housing is central to everything. It can explain so much about the physical impact of class, the kind of epidemiological impact of class, the kind of the mental health effects of class can all be written about and explained through our attitudes to housing in Britain. You know, we both grew up on council estates of kind of like similar age, like 1960s housing estates that were sort of built with a particular ideal in mind. And I think because we had both always had an interest, you know, I found out from Dawn that, you know, we both always had an interest in politics and how, you know, political policy sort of changes things and yet keeps things the same at the same time, you know, basically only succeeds in keeping things in, you know, roughly in stasis all the time. I think we're really interested in how council housing built in that era, in the post-war era, was both represented an ideal and the kind of the realities of how that ideal played out and what it was actually like to grow up in a place that was that was built with certain ideas in mind, but without all the sort of the messy kind of, you know, indignities of, you know, of poverty, and knowing that you live in a kind of you know, a kind of mono class, kind of monocultural, sort of mono-architectural environment. And so I think what we recognised in each other quite quickly was that our perspective, you know, as women who'd both grown up on council estates and who never expected to, or were never expected to, write about it, let alone get to sort of speak about it in a public capacity, you know, meant that I think when our efforts were frustrated, as kind of like they frequently were and are, to change the narrative, then we always would talk to each other about it. We always had somebody to talk to about it. Because I live in Liverpool and Dawn lived in London, you know, we didn't get to see each other as much as we would have liked to, but Dawn actually loved coming to Liverpool. And whenever I was in London, I would always come and try and see her. And we would always immediately, in a very, you know, in a very kind of sort of cathartic and sort of enjoyable way, immediately start getting angry about the things that we got bees in our bonnets about, and they almost always pertained to being people from working class backgrounds trying to work in the media. Basically all the idiots we constantly met. I wish I had a more, you know, poetic way of putting it. It just made us constantly angry how ignorant a lot of people that we encountered in the media, not just in the sort of you know, sort of very mainstream, you know, so-called impartial, you know, sort of BBC type media, but also for the some of the so-called progressive publications that we both wrote and write for, how ignorant people were about housing issues, about the unaffordability of housing, about the unaffordability of rents, about what it's actually like growing up in council housing. People have all sorts of very, very strange ideas about what council housing, what council estates are actually like, unless you're actually from one. And specifically, I think about the realities of living, if not actually on the margins, but sort of close to on the peripheries of the mainstream economy and mainstream society, sort of both unrepresented in media and either ignored or just spoken for and on behalf of constantly. And I think both what animated both of us and of what we both kind of wanted to do, what I want to continue to do, you know, ever more in Dawn's name, is just to sort of help to create a way to change the story. Really, it really matters. The economic and social background of writers really matters, because overwhelmingly writers still come from relatively privileged backgrounds, and there tends to be a very flattening effect in what gets written about, and then secondly how it gets written about. So for instance, you know, when you have people writing about the housing crisis from a position of being sort of interested and annoyed and indignant about it, but never having actually either experienced or come close to homelessness, for instance, or ever been in rent arrears, or ever had issues with respiratory or damp or difficulties with neighbours, any of those kind of completely quotidian problems that 90% of the population at some point in their lives will have had some experience of, but a disproportionate number of people who get to write about it have never had any of those experiences. You just end up with a sort of constant sort of rotation of people wringing their hands and saying something must be done without actually anything getting done. So I think we were sort of kind of doubly animated by housing and society, and how improving housing, improving the quality of housing, improving the quality of built environments, improving access to affordable housing, and basically making housing a right, as every sort of utility, as every basic should be. If we could find a way to kind of write about those things that makes it seem as urgent and as necessary as as people are writing and talking about COP26 right now, then there is possibly a way to change that story. And I think we both often felt like kind of lone voices that were at risk of either getting muted or just squeezed out altogether. Now, the thing is, I think Dawn absolutely refused to be muted. And there were obviously many attempts to squeeze her out of mainstream journalism, but she kept trying, and she continued to give her voice, almost like whether people wanted to hear it or not. She carried on saying the uncomfortable truths. And I think if you had an uncomfortable life, or you had an uncomfortable start, you're not really interested in comfort. I think this essay prize is absolutely necessary, because anything that increases the diversity of journalists' backgrounds, of writers' backgrounds, and anything that shines a light on the absolute centrality of housing and good housing, dignified, sustainable housing to how we live class in this country, just has to be a good thing, and does justice to Dawn's name.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. That's just wonderful. And I know you were contemporaries, and there was mutual respect between both of you on the work that you put out. But I cannot tell you how much of an inspiration your writing was to a young Dawn at university, to see that you could talk about lived experience and have a mainstream audience within newspapers was a real inspiration for her. So I just want to say thank you. We'll move on to Dom. Dom, you were a close friend of Dawn's and contemporary, and you wrote a lot about I suppose social affairs issues broadly at the same time. What did Dawn's friendship mean to you?
So me and Dawn became friends about 2002, 2014, 2015. Off the back of a couple of things, I've written a book about Sweden and about the rise and fall of the Swedish welfare state, and Dawn sort of messaged me about that, and eventually we ended up doing an event in London together around that. And I would say about Dawn is that she was happy to help people out who needed it, or where she was on board with the project, never would ask for any money, anything like that. Like, it was always for her about bringing along fellow travelers and bringing along people who she understood to be kind of doing interesting and kind of interesting journalism that generated new ideas and contributed something. Journalism is full of a lot of grifters, it's fair to say, a lot of people with quite narcissistic tendencies, and Dawn was very scornful of these people, quite rightly. But equally, on the other side, when she saw somebody who she recognized and whose work she valued, she was very quick to bring those people in. And so my friendship with Dawn kind of grew from that, and the more we interacted, sort of initially as a professional thing, and then more as a kind of friendship, that we realized that our experiences of going to university and going into journalism were very similar. So we were both, I mean, we were almost exactly the same age. He was about 6 months older than me. And we've both been children of the kind of New Labour social mobility project. So although Dawn came from slightly more modest background than what I did, we've both been to comprehensive schools. We've both been pushed to go to elite universities in order to fit what was expected of people at that time. And the narrative really in the mid-2000s was that if you were gifted, if you were intellectually worthy, you could take yourself from the lower middle class, from the working class, and become part of an elite system. So it was very much based about getting people to go to university, Oxford, Cambridge, UCL, Edinburgh, etc. And there's nothing wrong with that in itself. You know, we need to have access to universities, but you know, the whole implicit message of that is that actually there's nothing wrong with the system as a whole. You just need to come up through it. And one of the things that me and Don actually bonded over very quickly was that I'd written a response to something that Alan Rusbridger had written when he became a Don in Oxford after he left the Guardian. And he'd written this piece basically saying, well, I've sat in on all the interviews for Oxford Places, and I can tell you there's no discrimination, and you know, everyone gets into Oxford. You know, there's some truth to that. The stats show that state pupils going to Oxford have increased, but that's the people who choose to apply. And the big thing that I was kind of saying at the time, and which me and Dawn really coalesced over, was the fact that it's unthinkable to that kind of person that not everybody wants to be them. So that model of social mobility, which is kind of peak Tony Blair, is that if people work hard, if people are valid enough in terms of what they do, they can be like me. And that is a real problem with social mobility in Britain generally today. The way we conceive of social mobility is very problematic because it involves people going on class journeys without really addressing the underlying problems that cause huge gulfs in our standard of living and the way we live our lives in Britain today. So, you know, we sort of, I wouldn't say it was just because we hated the same people, but there was very much a sense that we recognized each other's experiences. And as I moved from working in journalism to working as an academic and looking more closely at these kind of sociological questions, it was really useful to have someone like Dawn on hand, and she contributed to my classes. You know, she would give me things that I could give to the students, and also she very kindly offered to talk to any of my students who wanted to see a working class person in journalism, which is, you know, very hard to find. Now, there are lots of people from working class backgrounds who might make it into regional newsrooms, you know, working sort of, you know, 19 grand a year on regional titles, kicking out clickbait. There's not very many working class people who end up writing for the Guardian or the New York Times. And that is the thing, you know, when you spend time in these circles, spend time around these people, you know, the New York Times and the Guardian in their own way are very good. Like, you know, they do good work, they do good journalism, but you don't have to be in that environment very long to realize that it's not just a question of there being no working class people there, but actually huge swathes of lower middle class and middle class people don't really get a look in either. And this is the really worrying thing about social mobility in journalism in the UK today, is, you know, we're not just excluding the poorest, as important as it is to include them. But as journalism changes and becomes a less economically lucrative career, a lot of people who actually make it into those positions are people who have the contacts and the financial and social capital to really play the long game, you know, live in London for 10 years and work for £25,000, that kind of stuff. So I think Dawn, from my perspective, you know, was a very good friend, and also somebody who statistically shouldn't have existed. I think, you know, she was so much of an outlier in terms of her profile relative to what she did, that there's no other contemporary quite like her. And I suppose to finish on that thought is that Dawn was often characterized as a radical journalist, right? So she was often seen as being kind of an arch Corbynista, as somebody who was, you know, doing the kind of press work for the Labour Party, which is how it was characterized all the time. Despite the fact there are plenty of people in mainstream journalism who do a lot of press work for the Conservative Party, was never talked about in that way. But the thing about Dawn is actually she was normal, like she was a normal person. You know, if you spend time with normal people, they have the same problems, you know, the same issues. that normality is an asset. And I think that anybody who's interested, not just in social affairs, but in any form of journalism that really addresses people's lives, benefits from having contact. You know, there is a bit of a kind of trope in journalism that you need to go out and meet the people, you know, and kind of go on a bit of a journey, almost like a safari, to kind of find out what's going on, you know, out in the north. And actually, you don't need to do that, because sometimes you'll just know those people already because it's you. And, you know, we see it repeated again and again. And I think, you know, if Dawn's legacy is going to do one thing for us, it's to show that there is a space for that type of voice, but that also it's not going to be easy. You know, Dawn pissed a lot of people off. She refused to take the easy route. She could have gone for the kind of, you know, successful, socially mobile person, built that into her story, which some journalists have done. She didn't. She actually chose not to abandon the people that she cared most about. And she took decisions which for her professionally were maybe not the most sensible, which allowed her to keep her integrity intact. And I think, especially if you look at her reporting around the Grenfell fire, you see that the way she writes about it and the way that she was able to speak to those families and to witnesses and other people, she spoke to them on a level. You know, she wasn't just jumping in and taking that news and going away and getting plaudits for, you know, brave journalism, which so many people do. She was there because she cared, and she wrote those stories in a way which showed that she engaged with her interviewees as equals. And I think that is a really impressive thing.
That's such a wonderful point, Don. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll revisit some of those things like later in the panel discussion. Let's bring in Sarah. Hello, Sarah. Hey, I'm all right. You're a close friend of Dawn's, and you're a freelance journalist. Tell us a bit about your friendship, and also the kind of support that Dawn gave to journalists like yourself.
Yeah, so I was thinking about a lot of Dawn's stories to prepare for this. Not all of them repeatable. But the one she would tell a lot was when her boss asked her to go to a credit rating agency drinks thing, where they invite lots of journalists, schmooze about. And one banker came up to Dawn and was like, "Oh, what do you write about?" And Dawn said, "Oh, I write about social affairs, society." And this person got really, really animated and thought, "Oh, champagne parties and horse racing and society." And Dawn had to clarify, like, no, poverty and austerity and that kind of thing. And they said, "Oh, sad society." Okay. So I was often texting Dawn going, how is sad society? Which really made me laugh, because whenever I read Dawn's articles about food banks or homelessness, anything, I didn't feel sad. I would feel angry, and I would feel really energized, and I would feel like I knew the names and addresses of the people responsible. We can all go there later. But I didn't feel that nothing could be done, which I think is really important with housing journalism. So many people agree that the housing crisis is catastrophic, but there's still not enough in housing journalism that shows how easy it is to solve. It's just a lack of political will. And Dawn really understood that. But we met in 2013. Dawn had just started her journalism career in sort of 2011, 2012. George Osborne was Chancellor. And I was about to start working at a poverty charity, and we were sharing a similar frustration with how poverty, and particularly homelessness and housing, got covered in quite a toothless, and you were saying safari kind of way. And I got really excited when I met Dawn as a journalist who understood that poverty is a function of austerity. It's not a symptom, and it's a long-term thing that wrecks people's lives for decades. Whereas a lot of journalists can tend to focus more on the property market, house prices, that kind of thing. And we know why that is, as we've been saying, it's a very posh industry. Dawn had a really good saying of, "If I've heard of your dad, I don't need to hear from you." It's very, if you're thinking of applying for the prize, I will Google your dad. And I'll be useless. But it was a wonderful thing because Dawn's background was very uncommon in journalism, and it's not uncommon in the real world at all. And that really shone through with how she clicked with her readers, that I think a small section of the British press were very jealous of. When she died, we set up a joint email, which, by the way, if you have someone in the public life who dies, set up a joint email because you'll get deluged, otherwise your Gmail will explode. But we got hundreds of emails from her readers who talked about what it meant to have their concerns and lived experiences mirrored in broadsheet papers. And I think it really showed that Dawn was an immensely popular and mainstream voice. When we talk about radical journalism, it might be a smaller part of British media, but it's the part that's most in tune with what people have the public appetite for, what they want to be reading about. And Dawn was just so in tune with that. What was I saying? Yeah, she was. The other thing about Dawn that really made her stand out, I think, was that her, as well as her investigative skills and her curiosity, was how she treated the people she spoke with. We had editors get in touch with us and say contacts had gone in touch with them to say that they'd been having a really rough time. Dawn was the first person to talk to them with any dignity and treat them like a human being. And that makes just such a lasting impression on people, I think. And I think you can have the biggest scoops in journalism and have the best skills technically, but if you don't know how to treat other people, it's kind of pointless, really. What I wanted to quickly end on was we had at Dawn's funeral, we had Gary Young was there and wanted to say a few words, and he chose to quote sorry, bear with me one moment. We'll be able to talk about this later.
It'll all be sorted in post-production. It's not.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it.
It's a fantastic quote. It's he interviews an athlete who did the Black Power salute at the 1968 Olympic
Tommy
Games.
Smith.
Thank you. And the quote read, "In life, there's a beginning and the end. The beginning doesn't matter. The end doesn't matter. All that matters is what you do in between. Whether you're prepared to do what it takes to make change, there has to be physical and material sacrifice. When all the dust settles and we're getting ready to play down for the ninth inning, the greatest reward is to know that you did your job when you were here on the planet." And Gary ended that by saying Dawn did her job, which was definitely what we all felt was the impression we were left with.
So much, Sarah.
Yeah.
Great. So we've touched upon this briefly, but Lindsay, if you could tell the audience a bit about Dawn's background and upbringing, but also why someone with that background and upbringing and lived experience was such a rare thing in the British media. If you could talk a bit about that, that would be great.
I'll try. I'll try. Well, I don't want to get things wrong. That's the only thing. So I will say what I know,
yeah.
And then maybe you can help me. Dawn was from Newport in South Wales. She grew up just outside the city centre of a council estate that was known for being the poorest estate in Newport. And because Newport is one of the poorest places in Wales, that was basically the poorest part of one of the poorest parts of the country. We both had connections with South Wales, and I think we're both really my grandmother and great grandmother, sorry, who I grew up with in Birmingham, were all from the valleys in South Wales, and we were both sort of very animated by that past. You know, not just 9/11, obviously, but also the miners' strike, and just the just knowing what it's like to come from that kind of place, a place that is completely and utterly overlooked in the sort of in the national story, you know, in the sort of, you know, polite conversation, in in literature, apart from much older texts. And if ever covered, is covered in a very sort of, you know, patronising way, and in a way that just doesn't ring true. So Dawn was from Newport and grew up in Newport, and from what I know, Viz, you might know better, is that she wasn't expecting to go. She wasn't expecting to go to university. Wasn't expecting to, certainly not to expect to go to an elite university like Warwick. This is complicated by the fact that she spent time living not with her parents, but first with her nan, and then in foster care. And I think the specificity of having spent time in care gave her background and trajectory just an even more sort of infinitesimal chance of sort of going from one position to another position than simply coming from a sort of, you know, straightforward, you know, sort of more, I suppose, sort of, you know, more straightforwardly working class background, because obviously it complicated her relationships, it complicated her relationship with the state. It gave her insights into directly what happens when the state fails. It gave her insights into how sort of clinging on to education, I suppose, clinging on to education as a kind of route. But then what other people from, you know, that sort of Tony Blair period, but that I also grew up with in the 1980s, you know, in the Thatcher period, that basically you take this golden ticket and you run with it. And if you choose not to run with it, then there's something more, not just actually like intellectually wrong with you, there's something morally wrong with you as well. So I think she took it, she got that place at Warwick. In that social mobility era, on that social mobility ticket, with a bursary. I think was bursary specific to care leavers?
I think so.
Right, yeah, a bursary specific to care leavers. And Warwick wanted to make people from, you know, challenged background, you know, sort of socially, economically challenged backgrounds welcome. So they held a reception for her, not for students on that particular bursary when they got there to Warwick. And I know from personal experience that Warwick is a kind of really off-puttingly posh university. I'm from Birmingham, and I went round to see Warwick because it was quite close to where I lived, and it was terrifyingly posh. She got talking to one of the staff members there, and they said to her, since she opened her mouth, they said to her, well, you're going to have to get rid of that Welsh accent if you're going to get on, if you're going to do anything with your life. So, you know, there's a number of things you could do with that situation, couldn't you? You could curl up into a ball and like never be seen again and just spend like 3 years in your dorm just to get through it. You know, or you could tell them to sod off. You know, or you could say, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. Yeah, I'm gonna develop a flawless RP accent, so nobody will ever be able to tell what, you know, like where I've come from, and you know, I'll meld seamlessly into the supposedly, you know, classless, accentless world of the elite professions of the national media. So, you know, as I said to Dawn, I said, it's just pure luck. It's just pure luck that I've still got my accent, because nobody ever said that to me. If somebody had said that to me, then I just would have been terrified and run away and done my best to get rid of my Brummie accent. It's only because it never happens that, you know, that I kept it. But anyway, Dawn did, you know, sort of modulate. She did modulate her Newport accent. But I think, you know, knowing why and knowing there was a sort of benefit to it, but never ever, I think, never ever forgiving the person and the institution that would allow such a slight to happen, but also just never forgetting it, never forgetting what that meant really, which is that, you know, in order to get on in life, you know, in British society, you know, you have to erase part of yourself, and you have to erase your, you know, the specificity of your origins, you know, either geographical or social. So I think the reason you know why we often, you know, talk so sort of almost like rapidly and animatedly with each other when we always met up, because we had so many sort of shared experiences of being, you know, the unusual person, sort of being the unusual person in a media setting, in a media social setting, in terms of, you know, working with editors, or you know, going to those kind of drinky parties and so on, and all this kind of stuff, and just like the always at the back of your mind, just thinking, what a load of absolute rubbish this is, you know, and yet feeling a desire and a compulsion to specifically still do that job, you know, to write, to get a story heard, to get a story across, to communicate with people who feel uncommunicated with, you know, and hopefully to change things. And are you going to let that? Are you going to let the fact that you're surrounded constantly by kind of quite ignorant, you know, sometimes actively unpleasant, often very on the surface very nice, but still very unthinkingly prejudiced and making assumptions about your background, about your experiences? Are you gonna sort of let those slide, or are you going to actually use them as fuel for the things you do write about and how you write about them? But ultimately, you know, to go back to what this actually just actually asked me, is that Dawn really was completely sort of out, you know, you could describe it sort of out on a limb, but to me it was kind of like out on a pedestal, really, in terms of how strongly and how fiercely she faced up to every single one of the sort of kind of quotidian challenges of entering the profession, where just about everybody else is from an extremely similar kind of background, and you're the one who's not. It just takes a lot of just basically waking up every morning and just sort of deciding to sort of keep going, really. That means that you don't just drop out and go and do the thing that, you know, everybody said that you were gonna do, you know, when you were growing up, you know, which, you know, could have been any number of the, you know, extremely essential, you know, extremely normal, usually extremely low paid jobs that just about everybody else does. But there was just something that sort of animated both of us, and every, I think particularly for Dawn, just basically just about everything was put in her way to prevent her from doing that.
Absolutely.
But she still did it.
I mean, this is the thing about, I suppose, journalism in the austerity years. Dawn might have been ever present. She was on like BBC News, Sky News, on the radio. She had a column in a national newspaper, The Guardian, but she was never well off. She never got well remunerated. She was always working class. Her entire 34 years was lived as a working class woman. And that was a unique perspective within the British press during that decade after the financial crash, decade and a half after financial crash. I mean, Dawn, could you give us a kind of outline of the state of play of journalism in the austerity years in Britain?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of things going on here. Obviously, we've got the broader context of austerity, right? So it's a political project which begins in 2010, and we're still living with that today, despite what we've been told about austerity being over. And within that, the British media and indeed the media globally has been through seismic, you know, absolutely catastrophic changes in many ways, which have seen a lot of the kind of middle level jobs at regional news level, especially, which were always a means of access to mainstream media for a lot of people from the lower middle class and working class backgrounds, disappear. So now, actually, although there are lots of media jobs, more than ever, those jobs are concentrated in London, and to get them, you have to really do the hard graft. So, for example, you know, for years, Dawn worked at the Guardian in different roles, eventually ended up as a columnist, but she was never fully a salaried staff member. You know, she wasn't given that kind of golden ticket. Whereas there are people there who are of similar vintage who are. And because of the way that newspapers work nowadays, to become a salaried member of staff, you generally either have to become an editor or you have to become a kind of special correspondent with a specific brief, and there aren't that many of those gigs around. So if we look at media more generally, what we see is that there is a huge move towards casualization and towards people basically being self-employed or working on short contracts, bearing their own costs. And like every other sector of the British economy today, that makes it really, really difficult to do more than just stand still. My experience of working as a journalist really through the sort of 2000s was that the fees were declining, we were being given worse and worse terms, and there was no movement to counter that. Now, if you were independently wealthy, or even if you happen to, be moderately well off and have a family you could stay with in London, that kind of thing, that put you in a better position. So there's economic inequality, but there's also regional inequality, and this is something that doesn't really talked about so much in the UK because it's the kind of wolf that hasn't or the dog that hasn't barked yet, because we talk about leveling up and stuff, but really we haven't begun to have a conversation about how the UK is structurally unequal on a regional level as well as on that up-down level. So it's for someone like Dawn to exist, like I said before, somebody who's from what would be considered, the phrase that's often used as nations and regions. So basically I mean Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and then the north. For someone to come from that background and make it the way they did is absolutely just unbelievable in many senses. The fact that Dawn came so far is impressive. But also, and as Biz just hinted at there, like Dawn did not die a rich woman. And I think, I don't think it's any disrespect to her memory to say that, for the final year of her life, when she was coping with lockdown, trying to cope with chronic illness, she was not in an economically comfortable position. There was nobody to come in. There was no mom and dad to come in and say, okay, come home living with us. There was no rich uncle. There weren't even that many. Don't have lots of friends, but none of us were super rich. We all helped her out as best we could. And I think that is something which we probably should be talking about, actually. The fact that somebody who enjoyed such a high profile, who from the outside at least appeared, what was a successful journalist, but the actual financial payment for that, or the kind of financial sustainability, was always very precarious. And I know that Dawn, when she was paid late by the BBC or by Sky for going on, that meant that she had to really think about where her next month's food budget was coming from, because it's very expensive to live in London. And this is really difficult of a lot of journalists today, even people who actually are on salaries. It's the thing you really want to do good journalism is time and space and money, and those things are very hard to come by. But I think also from the perspective of having an intellectual element to it, and Dawn was, it's a bit of a hanging face, but Dawn was a working class intellectual. She was somebody who was capable of, sparring with the best minds that she came up against. She was incredibly sharp. She was incredibly intelligent, but she did that not from a place of forgetting who she was. She did it from a place of knowing exactly who she was. And so this resource we have, this economic and time resource, which is critical to having an intellectual edge to journalism, just doesn't really exist in the way we need it to. And in some ways, the UK media quite likes that as well, because as we hinted at already, it's blind to maybe some of the inequalities that are built into it. And it's not until someone like Dawn comes on and knocks on the door and says, hang on a minute, this is how it's supposed to be, that people sit up and take notice. I know also that there were people who were made very uncomfortable by Dawn pointing these things out. So, for example, The Guardian, famously, she pointed out who someone's parents were, and they didn't like this at all, and to umbrage. There are people knocking around, and what typified this for me in relation to the cultural industries more generally is that the adaptation of the Sally Rooney novel Normal People, the actress who plays the lead in that was not a normal person. She was the daughter of the head of Sky Arts, which you didn't see in any of the PR material. But this is when we talk about the cultural and creative industries, which journalism is part today in Britain. We have to be really aware of this, and actually, I think we need to call it out and not be shy about saying how unfair it is, because whether you want to go into journalism or theatre or cinema or any of these things today, chances are, if you are state educated and from the kind of lowest third of income in Britain, you will not get there. You know, you will have to drop out and do other things. There are hundreds and thousands, I'm sure, of people across the UK who are very gifted writers, potentially very gifted filmmakers, theatre makers, whatever. You just never get near the chance to do so. And the fact that Dawn got there was a miracle. And the fact that she did what she did for so long was great, because it showed other people what's possible, and it really helped to profile how unequal any kind of creative career is in contemporary Britain.
Thanks, Dom. That, I mean, that's a perfect sort of like snapshot of an industry that has gone through very serious, almost existential crisis since the crash. And what's kind of interesting throughout Dawn's career was that while she was at the start of the career, you know, pretty much a unique voice within media, by the end of her life, at only the age of 34, there were lots of people like her, inspired by her, who wanted a crack at the mainstream and understood that the relationship was the mainstream media needs content and we can give new perspectives. And a lot of them found themselves, like Dawn, as a freelance journalist. I mean, I got so many messages from sort of young, like people from marginalized backgrounds, like women of color who'd written their first books in their 20s, saying how much seeing someone like Dawn in the mainstream inspired them to write their book, do their comment piece for a newspaper, do the paper reviews on television with no training and no support, no background, knowing that they'll only get small bits of money, but doing it because it was right, not to sort of be gilded by a dying industry. Now, Sarah, you're a freelance journalist and you knew a lot of freelance journalists that Dawn supported. In kind of what ways did she kind of give people advice and help them out?
I got really lucky. I got media trained by Dawn, which like rule one was like, don't trust journalists. Dawn was so generous with her time. It was really common to find out, to see maybe someone tweeting like, I've just moved to London as a freelance journalist, and to find out after she died, in particular with her, there's a lot, someone would say, Dawn dropped me a DM, asked me to come out for a drink, sort of showed me the ropes. And it wasn't just supporting people with knowledge and friendship, which was really important. Dawn was also very good at giving people a whisper network, telling you who was really dodgy, who to avoid, who was a corrupt charlatan, that kind of thing. I've still got a spreadsheet. And she also fiercely believed that journalism would only improve when worker rights in journalism improved. So she would talk a lot about how it's all fantastic if you get an investigative piece, say in a broadsheet, talking about 0-hour contracts at Sports Direct. But if your journalists are on precarious contracts, or they don't get paternity leave, they don't get sick leave, then you can't really hold your hands up and be like, why don't we have, why isn't journalism operating at full capacity? And Dawn was keenly aware that diversity wasn't just a nice thing to have in journalism, it's how it operates, it's how it holds power to account. So she was very fierce in how she looked after people, was hugely generous with her time, especially with me. I got very lucky to know her personally and professionally. I got edited by her when I wrote my first piece for The Guardian. Yeah, she was just...
I mean, this is the thing as well, when you find like-minded people within an industry, it's not like money needs to change hands, you know, like I would occasionally send drafts to Dawn to look over. She would do the same thing to me. We did this because we were friends and we knew that our intent was one of good. We were writing because we kind of needed to. And, you know, as Dom said earlier, when friends get into positions where they can commission you, knowing that, you know, you could do with a bit of cash, and then they spend time and there's, you know, I commissioned Dawn a couple of times in the last year of her life at Red Pepper. And I was kind of just like, look, my friend can do a book review, we can find a small bit of money. And you would see the most elegant piece written on a topic that you thought you knew everything about, that she would give a new perspective to. She wrote a brilliant review of Cass Mooder's book on the far right and brought in this perspective that I haven't seen in the British media about how far right movements across the world grow in part due to misogyny. You know, there's this idea of a kind of angry young man protecting women. And the reason why I haven't seen that perspective in the British media is because it's just men writing about the far right. White men get commissioned from both left and right to write about this really important topic. So Dawn can always bring a new perspective to things. I think it's probably time to open questions to the audience. And if you're watching the live stream, drop us a tweet, hashtag Dawn Foster forever. But is there anyone in the Mandela room who might have a question for any of the panelists or a question about Dawn that we could try and answer? Anyone?
Thank you so much for being here today. This has been absolutely fascinating, and thanks, Kirsty, for arranging it. It's been amazing. We're here as part of COP26, and I just wondered what your thoughts are on how Dawn might have written about housing in the context of climate, and here at the Youth Hub in terms of young people. A lot of us here from Edinburgh, and the challenges of housing in Edinburgh, and how do we address that in the context of climate?
That's such a good question. So for those who might not be able to hear at home, how would Dawn write about climate and housing in the context of COP26? Maybe we can start with Dom, because I know that you have written a lot recently about climate and sustainable housing.
Yeah, so I did a couple of pieces in the run up to COP. Partly because I wanted to, I felt that there wasn't maybe stuff that was going to come out in the Scottish press that needed to be written. One of the things that I went up to Orkney, and you'll hear lots about Orkney because, you know, wave energy, wind energy, loads of really cool stuff going on, all amazing, which is going to hopefully help us to hit the 1.5 degree target. But what no one talks about is that Orkney has 50% field poverty, and that although there is a lot of poverty in urban Scotland, the more rural you get in Scotland, generally speaking, and the further away you get from Edinburgh and Glasgow, the worse field poverty gets. And this is something that has just not been tackled and isn't really part of the national political conversation, because there's an obsession with, you know, I wouldn't say it's an obsession because they're good things as well, but there is a focus on bike lanes and electric buses and everything else. A huge amount of emissions in Scotland and across the UK come from home heating. Scotland's housing market is in a really bad state. We have, I think, I'm right in saying, over 300,000 tenement homes in central Edinburgh, central Glasgow, Dundee, and a bit in Aberdeen that are all built pre-1910. Really, really low grades of energy. Sometimes actually quite desirable to live in because people like to buy them, but they're a complete nightmare to maintain. And the government haven't really done anything about this, because to tackle those issues around the actual fabric of the building and insulating, heating, everything else would mean completely taking apart the ownership model, which exists or which has happily existed for the past 30 years, really, in terms of private landlords, some owner occupiers, and there's no real legal system to tie that together. And I've recently been trying to insulate my tenement in Edinburgh. It's been almost impossible to get money from the private landlords to do it. And you know, you find that the costs end up being borne by the housing associations on one hand, and the owners who have huge mortgages to pay because of the inflated housing. So yeah, I think that if Dawn were to have been able to come and cover COP, I think she'd probably be in the south side of Glasgow, knocking on people's doors, asking them about, you know, what their experience of winter fuel poverty was. Because I mean, I imagine most of you here probably live in Glasgow, you know what damp, cold Glasgow winters can be like. There are lots of other countries in the world that are damp and cold in the winter, and you don't have to be cold inside. But Scotland has set such a low level for what is acceptable that we still live with a legacy of that.
I think there's so much in writing about sort of social policy and government policy that a lot of the media like to keep opaque. So something like COP's happening and people talk in terms of, you know, numbers and statistics and using jargon that I think, you know, certain elite parts of civil service and media and of politics like talking about, because that doesn't talk about real people and their lives. And what Dawn was excellent at doing, and in her only book, Lean Out, she was very good at doing, which is taking a big issue, be it something like fuel poverty or feminism, you know, huge topics, and then using real world examples from people that she not only like spoke with, but mainly listened to and reflected their lived experience and connected it to something far broader. She was exceptional at doing that. Lindsay or Sarah, do you have any additions to Dom's point?
And how Dawn would be covering COP.
Mm.
I don't know.
You can do that after.
I don't have anything to answer what you said, to be honest.
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive. Maybe we can answer a new question.
Yeah, I think it's in line with what questions before. As my business of the scale house is the occupation of the abandoned homeless shelter on Center Street. I live nearby and I've been going there periodically to try and see if there's any new media coverage to talk about or if you need any help. And I can also notice that it feels like they fairly have a certain very low amount of coverage in spite of what they're doing to be kind of bold action of occupying as an adult country, especially in Glasgow, when you know the background of the housing crisis that is happening in Glasgow, bed in places, fire all the time, the delegates that don't have any accommodation, the therapy from the accommodation. And I just can't help but how can you rectify this lack of coverage on such small it's in the backyard. It's in our own backyard. It's happening there. People are doing real changes, and it feels like it's very big coverage. It's not for lack of giants coming and trying to interfere and talk to them, but there's still very actual output there. And then you see other pieces about shinier things happening. It feels like there's this competition during the COP, and when we're talking about anti-capitalist mindset, the housing crisis kind of relates to the ecology aspect, the economy aspect of it. It just feels like there's still this competition for attention, even though you think that as this is happening in Glasgow, there would be a light shown on activists and organizers and this kind of thing. So how would you say, how would Dawn rectify this kind of problem of coverage and inequality in the coverage of 26 and housing crisis?
That's such a brilliant question. So for those at home, there are a number of activist actions going on at COP that our questioner says hasn't necessarily garnered much coverage. And how would Dawn herself go to try and cover I suppose, what she would consider as important politically in the activism side as what's going on on the policy level? Lindsay, maybe you have an insight into that.
Yeah, I think the thing that was specifically really good and really important about Dawn's journalism is that she was kind of, she had a really, for want of a better word, kind of nerdish level interest in the intersections of different intersections of sort of lack of justice, basically. So I think she would have written pieces, again, bringing totally new perspectives to well-covered topics in a way that then sort of in a way that shone light on completely uncovered and basically invisible aspects, A, of the conference, and B, of actual, of actually the nature of poverty. I mean, she's very interested in spatial and geographical inequality. So, I mean, Dawn, consistently wrote about how, about how inequality is lived in place. She was a real devotee of the geographer Doreen Massey, who wrote brilliantly about spatial inequality on a world scale, and was able to introduce aspects of environmental justice, of anti-capitalism, of justice for women, in a way that brought all these things together. So I think just maybe not maybe she wouldn't necessarily have like talked about it as a sort of as an activist thing, but simply as a way of saying, well, you know, you can have a city where two completely different universes are coexisting 100 yards from each other, and that would have been the thing that animated her and made her interested in how and why. So, you know, I mean, you know, she was really, really interested, you know, would take time out to really, really study the statistics and the effects and the kind of, you know, the maps, literally the maps of how inequality, but both affects a wider place and a wider quality, but also the experience of both rich and poor in a single place.
And the reason why that's such an important question now is that a number of journalists who I know working for mainstream publications and broadcasters have had circulars sent around them, staff members, saying that if they show themselves to be in a polarized world on the side of a specific broad-based campaign, I'm thinking things like Black Lives Matter, things around LGBTQI plus rights, even climate, that their role within an institution is under threat. So I've had people of color journalists, young journalists, gay journalists saying that they cannot publicly show on their own private channels, social media channels, support for these broad-based liberatory activist movements, or their jobs under threat. Sarah, you went to a number of actions with Dawn. I don't think Dawn would have ever stood for that kind of missive being sent round. No. She would have raised her middle finger, I think, at that. But like, what do you think Dawn got out about being sort of both a autodidactic, like working class intellectual, as well as an activist, so a doer as well as a thinker?
Yeah, I mean, Dawn was a deeply moral person, which all journalists and people should be. As far as Dawn was concerned, as far as I'm concerned, for example, say, for example, you're a transphobe, you have no business interviewing anybody about anything because it shows that you lack a fundamental bit of decency. Dawn really stuck her neck out, standing up to things like bigotry, like transphobia, like Islamophobia, when many people just don't, who've got a lot less to lose, to be honest. So she really didn't have time for anything like that. She saw that as really, really vital. She was a really constant presence at direct actions as well. Always had a good sign. And I just think she knew that you had to walk the talk with me. That's not really much to say from me on that. But.
And after Dawn passed away, a group of Dawn's friends came together, and actually, if people wanted to say buy Dawn a pint on her birthday, on her 35th birthday, they could donate to organisations like Sisters Uncut, who have I think a no-nonsense policy when it comes to that form of bigotry, to organisations like London Catholic Worker. Now, Dawn was in the era after New Atheism sort of dominated the British and American press. Dawn was Catholic, and she was sort of proud of her faith. And a number of Catholic groups like Catholic Worker do a form of direct action that is informed by their faith. And then there's a third organisation, Ace of Clubs. Dawn used to volunteer at a homeless organisation based near where she lived in Clapham. And it was a really great thing to do in the aftermath of Dawn's passing, that money could be raised for those three organisations. So, you know, if you find yourself with the means, do donate to one of those three. I'm going to move on to a question that we've got on Twitter through the hashtag Dawn Foster Forever. It's from Amy, and it's: what qualities did Dawn have and aspiring radical writers need that made her such an incredible journalist? If anyone wants to go with that. There's also a question about Giles Corran that we're not going to answer as well.
Yeah,
go.
It's just curiosity. You know, I mean, Gary Young, who Dawn was very close to and is now a professor at Manchester University. You know, he talks to not just sociology students, but also to you know, practicing and would-be journalists about, you know, what you should be thinking about in journalism, what you should be thinking about in the approach to a story, indeed in the approach to anything, which is not sort of when you see a you know, a dog bites man story, just not like, oh, this is a story of an individual dog biting an individual man. It's like, how come the man came to be in that spot at that time? How come the dog came to be at that spot in that time? Why are there you know, are there more dogs in that particular area at any given time? Are there any particularly dangerous dogs known to be dangerous in a particular area at a particular time? And you start to build up a much more complex picture of what causes things, really, and what causes things to happen, and things, you know, like journalism. You know, Dominic was talking about, you know, the decimation of local journalism in the last, you know, sort of 10 or 20 years. And there are so many people who went on to become national journalists, you know, the generation certainly previous to Dawn, but even possibly a generation previous to me, you know, and I've been writing for 25 years, you know, and who basically say that you know, they gained their insight and their compassion and their you know, true kind of motivating force within a journalist by working on local stories, because it's about the sheer unfairness of everyday life for most people. You know, it's about court cases and the kind of trivial reasons why people end up, you know, in court or in prison, or the terrible scrapes that they get into, which is so often, in fact, almost universally to do with poverty. It's by joining the dots. It's basically about being curious and joining the dots, and just continuing to ask it, never stopping asking questions. When you think you've answered one question, then ask the next question, because it will always lead you to something else. And it's that sort of granular attention to detail that helps you to, or certainly helped Dawn to build up a really complex picture. That also she was able to communicate in a really direct way, because she really knew her stuff.
Absolutely, and the event, I think, where that's best encapsulated is on the night of the Grenfell fire. Dawn rushed over and spent the initial hours just helping locals, helping families, comforting people, you know, getting her hands dirty. It was only after then that when I suppose people had got over the initial shock, that she started speaking to people, getting people's experiences down in a notepad, and then working up stories for a number of newspapers. And it appeared on the front page of the New York Times, I think, within a week or so. And what was interesting is, whilst a lot of the British press focused on blame, Dawn kind of held those initial threads and ran with that story. So it was something that she kind of doggedly followed. She went and held Kensington and Chelsea Council to account in stories. She would write pieces for, you know, the Guardian's like society pages and Jacobin about this. She didn't want to let go to that story, because those people's lives were important to her as a human, not just as a journalist, in my opinion. Do we have any more questions from the floor at all? Anyone want to? We've got one on Twitter from Elena, which is, newsrooms are notoriously bad at encouraging and sustaining working class talent. How can we tackle this, and what needs to change? Maybe Dom.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, all the research suggests this to be true. It's partly to do with the behavioural thing. So the way you're supposed to act and the values you're supposed to express as a young journalist are not necessarily ones that come easily to people with normal backgrounds, because especially if you've done well to get that far, so if you work really hard at school, you know, you've got your degree, you get a graduate job in a newsroom or whatever, you're used to actually quite a meritocratic process. And for all its faults, universities are very meritocratic places. Like, what you write and how good you are at the specific task gets you the results. And you get into the real world and that's not true, and it's particularly within newsrooms and some of the, I'm lucky in that because a lot of my career has been in foreign journalism, I've actually not done that much newsroom work, but when I have had to engage with newsrooms, there's a real hack culture. And there's a celebration of the idea of being a hack. So people refer to themselves as hacks, half jokingly. But beneath that joke is actually a professional identity, which is, I'm prepared to fuck somebody over if it's necessary to write the story. I glamorize working late nights with loads of coffee and beer on my desk, that kind of stuff. But actually really, really unhealthy ways to work and live. But this is still very, very dominant, still very toxic, I think. And part of that is when you come into an environment like that, it's easy to try and ape those behaviors as well. And in my experience, the people who climb the ladder most quickly in those environments are people who immediately get the code and latch onto it. So they start basically being company men. And I use the phrase company men because often is men. So they will do what is asked of them. They won't ask too many questions, and they won't have too many moral scruples. But also, when we talk about cultural capital, we talk about the series of codes and the series of behaviors that allow people to enter certain spaces, basically. And what we see in, take something like the BBC, for example. And BBC does have people who come from working class backgrounds and gone on to have very successful careers. There are always exceptions, and often these will be pointed to as cases the BBC are very proud of. But fundamentally, when you go into a newsroom and your norms and your approach to things is very different from other people's, right down to the way that you speak and interact, it's very difficult. And actually, people from working class and lower middle class backgrounds tend to often show much more deference, be much more polite when they come to those environments because they feel lucky to be there. Whereas people who are from more elite backgrounds, they will often have the confidence just to go straight in and, fresh go, they start pitching stories, they talk to their superiors as if they're equals as well, which is very important in power dynamics. So we bring all the baggage of class society into newsroom with us, basically. And it's something which, again, like I said earlier, people don't like talking about that much, because once you start unpacking that, you really begin to see the whole house of cards is going to tumble. And so I think that, it is hard for working class people, but with the same token, that doesn't mean you should stop. It's really important that people do persist, and that, they say, punch up, not down. That is true of this as well. Like, bring people with you, make sure that you are able to use any progress you've made to help other people as well, because that is what will ultimately make the difference.
And a lot of this is anecdotal, but Dawn really loved working within the mainstream. She loved being on the BBC. She loved having her name, her byline in The Guardian. She really got a kick out of it. And when speaking to colleagues at both The Guardian and the BBC, it was always, the floor manager or the makeup artist at the BBC that really enjoyed spending some time with Dawn. It was always the sub-editors or people on kind of relatively precarious contracts in a newsroom that Dawn's presence there was kind of sustaining as a strong, confident, working class woman. And Dawn, I think, did very well at having a kind of foot in both camps. Yes, do the mainstream stuff, but she also, she wrote blog posts for friends. She wrote a really powerful piece about food for one of her friends' food blogs. She didn't get any money for it, but it's a really important bit of work. And whilst, she would, read the papers with some horrible, minister from, forgotten minister from the New Labour years, she would also appear on mates' podcasts, with terrible sound recording equipment, and talk to them for 2 hours. So, a foot in both camps is a good way of looking at it. I think this is going to be the final stretch, but I do want to ask a final question to each of our panelists. And it is this idea around the housing crisis. How can media affect something as seemingly overwhelming as an ongoing housing crisis in Britain? What's the best case scenario for writing about something that might help affect positive social change? Who wants to go first?
You're looking at me. Before this session, I cornered some housing charity friends. I was like, what do journalists do really badly when they write about the housing crisis? And what do they do well? And they talked to me for like an hour, mostly about the bad stuff. There is good stuff. And they talked about everything they wanted to see more of is what Dawn did, which is often giving very practical advice in your coverage of issues. I know when she wrote about Grenfell, she directly said to the reader, if you are angered by this, you need to email your MP about this, you need to send a freedom of information request about this. It was all very specific, useful, practical stuff. Also, what I've been told is journalism is not always good at following battles in housing before big success happens. You might be told it's too local, it's too small, and it's really important to push against that. Dawn was really good at finding different small campaigns and finding ways to make those stories happen. And really, it's just about, kind of making people realize that change is very possible. And just that's it, really.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
Don.
I think that you can look at this in terms of how the media operates structurally. So if you go back to the 90s, one of the things I always remember growing up was getting a newspaper, any newspaper, and you would always have a massive property supplement in it. It was just pictures of houses you could buy, basically. You don't get those anymore, but like with other types of classifieds, those supplements were really crucial to the economics of making newspapers work. And what that has evolved into now is more of a kind of like Instagrammable lifestyle approach to property. So newspapers, particularly at the time, still have property supplements, but they're not really about buying houses. They're really about jumping into another world. And the problem is with that is that a lot of our housing and property journalists now live in this dream world. So they are basically paid. Their job is to go out and find things that look really nice. They can write their own sort of vignettes about. And so when, you know, the number of people who are nominally property journalists in the UK or housing journalists is actually very high, or higher than you would expect. But those people are not looking at housing as a total concept, as a holistic thing. They're looking at it as an asset, essentially. And I think that one of the things, and I'll be open, I don't know exactly how this happens. I think that one of the things that really needs to happen is to just reframe housing not as an asset, not as something which is about investing your dreams in, but about something that you live in and allows you to go to bed at night and be warm, which is what a lot of people need. And I think a big part of that is actually moving away from this extremely kind of voyeuristic approach to property as the aim of some form of social mobility, which is how 90% of the time is portrayed. And even in really well-meaning things, like a lot of the kind of cool architecture geek stuff that's come about the last couple of years, like pictures of modernist estates and stuff like this, like there's not really much analysis of what that actually means politically. Now, I think we really need to look at where housing journalism, in a very mainstream sense, is going wrong from that perspective.
Brilliant, Dom. And a final word from Lindsay.
Housing, gosh, where is it? Well, having just made a radio series about housing for the BBC, where for obvious reasons, I have to be really, really, really careful about, you know, impartiality, or, you know, so-called impartiality. I would say that it's really, really necessary to tell individual stories, but I think where housing journalism and where, as Dominic described it, which is mostly property journalism, but where journalism about housing and about the places we live in repeatedly falls down on is telling the individual stories without joining them up to wider problems, and without sort of almost describing housing problems as if they somehow happen in a vacuum. So they're localized individual issues that's basically too complex and too much of a wicked problem for anybody to be able to sort out. And I think constantly with housing journalism, the politics is taken out of it. I mean, it's like everything, you know, it's like every solvable social issue, you know, which are, you know, broadly speaking, all eminently solvable. The politics is always taken out of it. So you know, the one thing that everybody writing about housing or even thinking about doing it is just keep the politics in it.
Well, the Dawn Foster Memorial Essay Prize will be open from today and it will run for the next couple of months. You can probably find about it on Twitter. We'll put up web pages. But if you are under 35 and you can write a 1,500 word essay on any aspect of Britain's housing crisis, you stand to win a prize of £1,500, or if you're a runner-up, £200, and you will get published in the magazine Red Pepper. I'd like to thank the sponsors, and I would love to thank all of you guys watching at home or in the room for asking such wonderful questions. But most importantly, if we can give a round of applause to our panelists, Lindsay Hanley, Dominic Hind, and Sarah Woolley. I'm Kay Biswas. Bye. It's great. Enjoyed that.